Welcome to the look back on Persona 4 Arena Ultimax, a game featuring the cast of both the Persona 3 and 4 cast after the events of their respective games. As a newcomer to fighting games and a player who has experienced both tales of P3P and P4, I didn't know what to expect, both in progressing the game and how I would perform. But after engaging with most systems that P4AU has to offer, I can confidently say that I still have no idea what I'm doing. I've been on this for 6 hours. Well, since the gameplay is fundamentally different than my usual genre of games, I've decided to format this look back into 3 different sections: story and characters, the actual fighting, and the different modes you can engage in. So let's begin, because this look back is
barely getting started!
Hey Umbra, just calling to remind you that after you're done recording this, you need to then give me the recording for the SMT3 look back, so just don't forget we gotta pop on over to... Right. Let's do this. The tale of Persona 4 Arena Ultimax takes place shortly after the events of Persona 4 in early 2012. For the Persona 3 cast, it's 3 years after the events of the Dark Hour, and the whole cast has an entire glow-up, excluding Kodomaru. They just gave him a new jacket. The story occurs in 2 different major arcs, the P1 Grand Prix and the P1 Climax. Now, here's my first piece of criticism. Upon entering the story menu for the first time, you unlock the first chapter to both the P4A and the P4 story. As a new player, I had no idea which one came first, so I ended up starting the wrong one. It's not a huge complaint, but I will point it out since it can genuinely mislead a new player. Progressing the stories was very seamless and easy to understand though. Each character had an alternative ending alongside their canonical one, which made for even more crossover interactions and fan service among the characters. You also don't need to be proficient at fighting games to enjoy the story. P4AU has an auto mode in which your selected character will fight for you. You can also mitigate a lot of the fighting yourself by either turning down the amount of rounds down to 1 or the difficulty to safety. So for players who just want to enjoy the story, it's easy to create that experience with these in-game settings. So about the story, if you play every single character's perspective in episode P4A, it begins to feel like you're in purgatory. Basically, you're witnessing the same story roughly 10 times with minor alternatives in the endings. Yu, Yosuke, Chie, Yukiko's roots are close to identical, Kanji and Teddy's are a bit more unique, Naoto, Akihiko, Mitsuru, and Aegis's are also identical, while Labrys's and Elizabeth's are very unique. After playing through them all, I highly recommend only going through the roots of your favorite characters unless you want to witness all the character interactions between the cast. A lot of the dialogue and cutscenes are reused for the important parts of the P4A story in each character episode, so I would only say it's worth it if you want the alternative endings. My thoughts on episode P4A are relatively mediocre. I think it just wasn't for me with the whole hallucinations to get friends to fight each other. The plot felt really disconnected from episode P4, which comes right after. The concept of persona fragments and show's whole introduction came way too late, where they could have been teased or hinted uniquely in each character's episode. Labrys, however, was a great character in my opinion, and I'm glad that they gave her a very rich backstory in her episode. She's a great tie-in character to both the P3 and P4 casts together. So episode P4 follows immediately after the various endings of episode P4A. Are you still following? In the second act, everyone is here. The remaining P3 members are introduced, Sho and Adachi, and even the Velvet Room attendants including Theodore, which was the most surprising addition. I guess this canonizes the fact that the FemC route does occur, but perhaps in another world. This story was more enjoyable because it didn't require the build-up, which is what episode P4A was consistently. Characters were separated into groups and all met up at different levels of the school. Unlike Labrys, I found Sho to be a really underdeveloped character though. His appearance is out of nowhere, and apparently he was monitoring the P4 cast during the events of 2011. Overall, he also had a really unlikable personality, which made his backstory and redemption arc not as interesting for myself. His backstory doesn't get developed or explored to the degree that Labrys does, and after the true ending, we don't get to see much of his change of heart before he just leaves. Sho is designed to be a foil to you if he had no friends, and Adachi if he didn't have his rules. His principles are what make him a good reflection for these two characters, but they don't reinforce Sho as a standalone character himself. As for the endings, of course, Atlas had to pull another big bad god to be the true mastermind behind this world-ending incident. To be honest, I don't really remember or care too much about him, other than the fact that Yu and Adachi took him out together by fusing their Izanagis, which was pretty damn cinema. Episode P3 then follows, which is pretty much just a mirror story of episode P4. It tells the same tale of episode P4 with the focus on the new P3 members. There are slight differences to the original in some of the later scenes, and instead of Yu being the focal protagonist to confront Sho, it's Labris. In this story, I found Labris to be a much more suitable and relatable character to Sho during the final confrontation. They were both treated as weapons and artificial to some degree, and discarded by the Kirijo group and its associates. And then finally, we have episode Adachi, which is the last story to be unlocked, and boy was I surprised. Rarely does a villain get expanded on, let alone get their own tale. I think the last time I recall playing a game that had this was Final Fantasy XV with episode Arden. Anyways, I would say that if you like Adachi, playing through this entire game just to get this is 100% worth it. Adachi is a very flat but relatable villain in P4. He's still the same person but holds firm to the rules that he created for himself to abide by the world's law. What makes Adachi's short episodes so interesting for me is that we get to see his inner thoughts. He mentions seeing himself in Sho and how he's still young and has a lot of chances to redeem himself. He still hates the world, but just because he doesn't care that it ends, doesn't mean that others have the right to take it from you. And his conclusion is very melancholic, in which he comes to realize that all this time he had a bond with Hiroshima. So overall, the stories felt a bit repetitive, going from one tournament inside the TV to another immediately after. I guess you need to find a specific reason to get the characters to fight each other while maintaining continuity on the one-on-one rules. It was really nice to see how each of the Persona 3 cast members are living their lives now though, now that they're all high school graduates, except Ken. As for the P4 cast, a lot of them are thinking about their future careers and paths that they'll take after the school year. If I were them, I'd get the hell out of Inaba immediately. It's been the battleground for a god 2 times now, and I'm not sticking around for a 3rd time the next time Yukun visits. So before I even step into my thoughts about the fighting portion of the game, I want to preface that I haven't engaged in the online play in any capacity, and don't plan to, since I'm not really into competitive play in single-player games. So my perspective on the combat function is strictly against the CPU. So Persona 4 Arena Ultimax is a 2D fighting game. Apparently it's different from a 3D fighting game. I didn't know the difference until I started this title. That has 22 playable characters, but only one of them matters. I like how each of the characters distinctively have skills and abilities based on both their personas and weapons. The mechanics are also integrated into the lore with all-out attacks, one-mores, and persona cards. As a newcomer, all the capabilities that you have to approach battle was overwhelming, and still is for me, but I did find myself able to intuit mechanics that were more comfortable for myself. I'll talk more about my playstyle a little later. I do want to point out that the tutorial really helped expand my knowledge on what you can do with your fighter. A lot of the learning came from feeling. I found myself for the first time using the D-pad to make my presses more precise, since I was having a lot of trouble with the joystick sensitivity when trying to do air or crouch movement. I think the game was meant to be played with a fight stick.
Yeah, no shit.
Since the button inputs are color-coded. When I tried Risei's live on stage skill, for instance, the button presses are not as advertised on a traditional Xbox controller, which is what I use. There's probably a mod to adjust this visual impairment, but the colors can be intuitive to a traditional controller. Well, unless you're colorblind. When it comes to my personal preference in playing, I found that instead of swiping the joystick or D-pad as a curve to execute SP skills, it was easier to input them by hitting the down and then left or right D-pad. I also used and enjoyed the S hold feature quite a lot, since it made me able to experience the flashier moves of a character without having to master the controls as a newbie. I never really got technical into combos or using SP skills since I know that my brain won't remember those inputs, but simple tech like all-out attacks, grabs, persona attacks, and the normal attack auto combo did make me feel like I knew what I was doing instead of just button mashing. There are a ton of functions that I never personally experienced or just didn't use. One of the big ones include the shadow variant playable fighters. I heard that fundamentally they're more advanced, as they can activate Shadow Frenzy, which exponentially raises the capabilities of your fighter, so that you can string together or animation cancel SP skills as you perform them. They seem to be high reward fighters for players who are good at combos because shadows also have the drawback of not awakening when pushed to low health. I also didn't make use of one mores or guard cancels, more so because they require multiple button presses that were too complicated for me to think of, especially during the heat of battle. For me personally, I found my comfort zone in spacing myself away from my opponent and starting my animations before the enemy got in range, but this strategy probably only works against the CPU. Overall, I enjoyed my first exposure to playing a 2D fighter. It's certainly still a lot to take in, but I find it less overwhelming now that I've decided to focus my mastery on one character for now and not worry about the mechanics that are more advanced that can complicate basic learning. Finally, we get to the different playable modes in P4AU. Besides the long story episodes of P4A, P4, P3, and Adachi, there are a total of 3 separate game modes: Arcade, Score, and Golden. The interesting characteristic about the Steam version of this game is that P4AU on this platform is the remastered variant. That means that all of the unlockable DLC that would be otherwise gained from both the Arcade and Score modes are already accessible from the start. Arcade mode is a simple, arcade, sequential style progression game mode. You pick your fighter and go through 8 rounds of battles in the end, and there's an arbitrary rating and scoring system that, I suppose, determines how much P dollars you get.
The fucking P dollars.
So if you're like me and don't play online, you can still farm for the P card icons and titles by playing Arcade. Although I don't know why you'd farm for them if you're not playing online in the first place. Score Attack is next and is pretty much identical to Arcade mode, but with more options. You select your character, difficulty, and then one of 4 courses that go through 10 rounds of battles. Finally, there is Golden Arena mode, which is an RPG system featuring character growth through levels, stats, and skills. The formula is quite rudimentary as you go through a long gauntlet of fights through a selected course to see how far you can go. Your progress is saved at certain milestones, and eventually when you reach the higher floors, the character you've curated will really matter as the opponents become quite powerful. I'm not sure if it's a good way to practice or train, given that some skills completely change your fighter, or rather your playstyle, but it's a pretty fun mode where you can customize your character. And that's the show. The game itself ran well through all my recording sessions as well as the fights. My end goal is to gain some proficiency at playing Adachi and reach the end of the Golden Arena courses. I only recommend this game though, despite my high praise for it, for 2 types of players: the Persona fan or the fighting game fan. It's a heavy dialogue game that expands on the lore, so if you're in it for that, then it's definitely for you. And if you're a fighting game fan, you're not gated from any modes or content by avoiding the story or getting straight to the fighting. So there's that for you as well. Alright Atlas, now release Persona 5 Arena Ultimax so I can main Akechi.